What about the ordinary Jonas?
That was bad.
Just FYI, this guy's had a drink, so he's gonna be a bit leery on the podcast.
All right, hello and welcome to this week's Life of the Party, a deep dive into everything to do with your party, the Green Party, a New Left Party, whichever party we all end up being a part of. I'm your host, Todd, and I'm here with my friends and comrades, Shanice, McBean.
Hello, hello.
And Jonas, Marvin.
Yo, yo.
So this week, we're going to be taking on two very contrasting topics. It's going to be the bold, bright, visionary win that is Zohran Mamdani in New York, and also the various Your Party assemblies that have been going on across the UK. I just want to say thank you again for all of the support that everyone's given the podcast so far. We've broken 1,000 followers on Spotify, which is really, after 5 episodes, it's just like really, really sick. So, thanks for everything you're doing. Please keep commenting. If you've got anything that you want us to hear, email us podlifeoftheparty@gmail.com. So yeah, Jonas, you've been looking at what's going on with your party assemblies.
Yeah, I've been tasked with the joyful task of looking at the magic roundabout that are the Your Party regional assemblies. That's fantastic.
Come on, mate. It's not that bad. It's not that bad.
So these regional assemblies are part of the party's foundation process, right? And what we talked about in the last episode is the kind of documents, the 4 documents that they're going to discuss about the structure, about what the party stands for. And before I start, I just want to say thanks to all of the comrades who spoke to me and offered me insights from Manchester, Bradford, South Yorkshire, Haringey. Really, really useful stuff. I'll start off in Bradford, a place close to my heart. So there are 160 people, mostly 60 years old plus, particularly of the Corbyn era variety, who attended. Many of the attendees commented upon the fact that the event was terribly organised and communicated even worse. A kind of just a constant pattern across a lot of the assemblies, to be honest with you. And in this instance, criticism and questioning of the format and structure was shut down briefly by a facilitator overstepping their remit. Despite efforts from the top to get each breakout group to discuss a specific part of the documents each, that's the way they wanted to structure the regional assemblies, most groups took their own initiative. Most breakout groups took their own initiative at this event and ran through the docs, inevitably launched into a kind of discussion on the broader politics, the sort of car crash that was the launch, the local group formation questions, building power. Someone who I spoke to about the Bradford Regional Assembly kind of suggested to me that the breakout group format seemed designed to stifle the communication of minority positions and collective discussion. Take from that what you will. Composition-wise, I think these questions are important. Like the Bradford attendees were split between Corbyn diehards, Sultana supporters, and a good portion of people who thought that neither of them should be anywhere near the leadership, but also didn't have any obvious solutions as to who should. There's a large consensus that the independent MP should bounce. For people who don't know what that means, it means they should exit your party.
Thank God for that. Thank God for that.
And there were some questions about a kind of some people, even though the debates were quite rich, some people were approaching them with a kind of ideological rigidity coming from particular far left groups and the particular kind of political inclinations that bears. And one thing that actually came out, or two things actually, sorry, there was a recognition that the climate crisis was kind of absent from some of the founding docs and from the broader statement. And when people talked about community organising, it was clear that it meant very different things depending on who you were. So that was Bradford. In Haringey, it was noted that the crowd was similar in age to the Bradford audience. Lots of folks got bored and left early. These events are 5 hours long, by the way. But there was enthusiasm for the proposals, particularly from the Unity platform. So this was the Unity platform that was formed at the World Transformed, which combined the Democratic Socialists for Your Party, Organising for Popular Power, and others. And there was a recognition of those demands themselves. In particular, there was excitement for the workers' wage proposal. This is the idea that MPs should earn a skilled workers' wage. In Manchester, again, the event was badly organised. There was no central person there and no proper autonomy given to local organisers. Inadequate numbers of facilitators, and they hadn't been sufficiently briefed. No lunch, no refreshments, or barely any refreshments. It started late. It was quite badly communicated to members and supporters, and there was lower attendance than possible, in part because people didn't build it, because they were told or had assumed that it would be full. So that kind of connection that you have between the centre and between the local branch, the lack of connection that you have between those two things has meant that the local group, which doesn't really have any control over this thing, can't build it and can't make it the kind of promising, vibrant event that it should be. And apparently there was a last-ditch attempt to recruit facilitators a day and a half before the event, which for me kind of sums it up. Again, the room was a bit pale-male and stale. There were about 125, 150 in attendance. Similar composition to the Bradford event, except there was a kind of younger cohort of leftists and adjacent people who identified with the Greater Manchester Left Caucus. And this group took notes in their groups to get a good conveyance of opinion and pushed for indicative votes when reading the notes out to get a visual reading of the room sentiments as well, which I think was quite good. Just to give you a sense of like what the Greater Manchester Assembly voted for, it voted against reserved spaces for MPs, government representatives in leadership bodies. The party's first leader in CEC should be elected by the whole membership and should serve until the next party conference, which should happen within a year. Membership isn't reliant on immigration status or residency nor age. Establishing branches should be the primary priority. And a bunch of really important things, such as enshrining a code of conduct in support of LGBTQ+, anti-racism, transphobia across the whole party, as well as 50% of funds to local branches. And again, what kept popping up, the question of MPs and representatives should be on a worker's wage. But I think perhaps the most interesting of the regional assemblies that I got some real feedback from was South Yorkshire. So South Yorkshire consists of Sheffield, Doncaster, Rotherham, Barnsley and Chesterfield branches. And they just went ahead and organised their own regional assembly relatively in advance, held a Zoom call to go through the documents and prepare those people for discussions, and very consciously left it to members to decide how they want the assembly to run. After putting out an online survey, it was really clear that the members were not happy with how the structure of conversations centred the conversations that the political centre of your party wanted, and wanted it to be a decision-making assembly rather than simply an indicative one. This was attended by around 200 people. It was hybrid and in person. And the issues that came up were concerns about rights, structures and funding for branches, which I really like actually. They carried out visualization exercises, which gave attendees the option to choose between the original drafts of documents and amendments made by the Sheffield steering committee to the YP documents. And interestingly, I think it was on the suggestion that your party branches should organise regular community assemblies, that there was agreement with the centre and not the local branch, which I thought was an interesting tension. And again, there was a big support for transparency and for all MPs to be on a skilled worker's wage. There are also, I should say, branches in the country who have not been represented in the kind of process of democratic founding and deliberation. And some branches have offered to organise regional assemblies for areas much larger than their own branches, asking only for facilitation, and have been totally ignored by the centre, which is something to consider. I guess, like, to sum up at least the starting point on this, which is like the overwhelming message seems to be that there's a kind of frustration with the lack of transparency and a desire to see as democratic a party as possible. And I think there's a frustration, and in the case of South Yorkshire, a set of solutions for the fact that the existing leadership are really out of touch and underrate how capable and sharp its support base is across the country. But also there's this tension here, isn't it? Because like it has this quite engaged, relatively politically sharp group of people who are involved in these processes, but the actual engagement in these processes has shrunk. And so the people who are engaged in these processes do seem like the much more highly politicized people. And so, yeah, for me, one big take home from the kind of feedback that I got from people from particularly across the north is that it was so clear that your party should have handed some of this process over to members, because they're much better at it and they have a much better sense of how to run a good democratic assembly in their areas.
And it's very interesting that the area which those branches cover, so you said Barnsley, Chesterfield, Sheffield was the one more?
Doncaster, Rotherham.
Doncaster, Rotherham. Only one of those places really is a potential green kind of like area of strength, which would be Sheffield. Yeah. And all of the rest of them, I mean, I'm from just outside Barnsley, and from my knowledge, none of the rest of those places have a significant green contingent. Maybe in Marvin, but like not really in any of the other places. So it is interesting that it was those branches that kind of like put themselves forward to do this, to like organise it on their own and organise it in a really good way. I mean, I went to the one in South London the other weekend for, I'll admit, I only stayed for half of it. I only stayed for the first half. I was knackered. It wasn't just that I didn't enjoy it. I was knackered. And it was, like, there were a couple of hundred people there. It was, the room was full and it was well attended and it was well organised in the sense that everybody, like got in there and got going pretty quick. But I think there was this real problem where you had just this increasing polarisation between the leadership who were running the thing and then a lot of kind of like discontented activists who were there trying to make the assembly into a decision-making body and failing to do that. Like they stood up at the start and they all made these kind of coordinated points from different parts of the room and tried to shout down the facilitator and stuff. And I understand where they were coming from, but I think to some of the more casual observers who turned up, and I was chatting to a few of them, and these are people that had never really been involved in a party before. They weren't in Labour, they weren't in the Greens. This was their first big project. Levels of political education were, like they were beginners to this stuff. They just thought, what the fuck's going on? You know what I mean? This both a group of people running the thing who couldn't get a grip on it, and also all of these people that were shouting at them from the floor. And it's sad that we've ended up in this position of quite intense polarization between the activist base and the leadership. I think the other thing that I'd say is that just it was another problem of having people with very different levels of engagement and levels of politics in the room. It meant that the questions that they were asking us were, I think, relevant for hyper-engaged activists, but if you weren't hyper-engaged, it just wasn't really relevant for you. It was questions such as, and bear in mind you're in a busy room with lots of people talking, you've only got 45 minutes or whatever, it's questions such as, how should we elect the leader, the deputy leaders, the CEC, all of these different parts of the party? How often should we elect them? What voting system should we use? Like these very kind of like technical and specific questions, which are really hard to debate if you don't all have a base knowledge of, like different ways of voting within parties and whether this should be proportional or majoritarian and what STV does in this kind of election. Like, unless you have that base knowledge, it's kind of pointless to have that conversation in that room. So I think it really suffered from that as well. Yeah, it really suffered from that.
Yeah, you guys have both mentioned the word engagement. And I think for me, that's a key one because I've completely checked out of your party and I can't lie.
We have one non-nerd.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think for me, it doesn't give us good signs for what the conference is going to look like at the end of this month. The organisation around the assemblies has been poor at points, assemblies not having enough facilitators, them being kind of cancelled and set to a different day, or them being scheduled at the same time as like big social movement events. So for example, there was one, I think it might have been the Harrogate one, that was scheduled at the same time as the United Friends and Families annual march and the anti-fascist march, all happening at exactly the same time, which is, indicative of just not being serious. And then the scuffles and fights in your party have continued. And for me, it's just left me feeling like, no, I've got to be keeping up to date with what's happening in your party because I do a podcast on the damn thing. But it's not filling me. Yeah, it's not filling me with enthusiasm. I guess one thing that has been positive is I saw that Zara Sultana is doing a talk with the Democratic Socialist, what do you want to call them, a faction?
Yeah.
And I think that's actually really good, having someone at the centre and at the top of your party engaging with the tough political questions around, the democratic deficit, what conference is going to look like, what voting and what participation and engagement should look like. That's really good. But that's not really coming from much else. And also these are quite niche discussions and conversations. And I just feel really worried about, if I'm feeling tapped out, how is the ordinary Joe, the ordinary Jane feeling?
What about the ordinary Jonas?
That was bad.
Just FYI, this guy's had a drink, so he's gonna be a bit leery on the podcast.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also just a timelining thing though, isn't it? Because we're now in this very internal phase in your party where there's all of this debate over the specifics of conference documents and stuff. And I actually think one of the difficulties for that process is that the documents that they put out, the documents, that killed Jonas. If you could see Jonas's face right now, his head's about to explode. Like
Someone's picking you up, man.
the documents they put out are they're just fine. You know what I mean? They're just fine. Like they're They are basically democratic. Some things need to be better, some things need to be worse. But there isn't just any big battle over these documents. Like, the battle will come later when we'll see if the documents mean anything or if they're just pieces of paper with stuff written on them. And I think that's why it is just a little bit like, now. It's just a bit like, well, okay, there's a lot of detail and it doesn't feel like caring about it is that important. So it's left to the, the real kind of like nerd section of the activist left.
Yeah, and like one of the reports I read about, like the Bradford Regional Assembly, like one of the comrade who wrote the report kind of reasonably said, like when it comes to the actual founding conference in November, what's the date today? It's like the 7th? The 8th of November, like the founding conference is in like 22 days. Like if you work, if you struggle with money, if you have childcare, you need to have had made arrangements already. So like it's quite exclusive on that front. And then when I say some groups have been ignored by the centre, like I'm in one of those groups, like, and so what we've decided to do, kind of emulating the South Yorkshire experience, is it's too late to have a regional assembly now, right? It's too late to pull that off. So someone in our Your Party branch had the brilliant idea that maybe we just have a kind of an open meeting and we have a bit of a political discussion about what kind of party we want, what kind of party we think we need, and then also we can use that as kind of learning thing for people to learn together how to engage with what is quite an opaque democratic founding system and bring people with us. But I always have that tension that you kind of alluded to, Shanice, which is like why would anyone be interested in this?
yeah, but just on that, at the same time as it being dry as dust, it's so important because these founding documents will be used as a disciplining tool in the not too distant future. Whatever goes into these now are going to be, the stick to beat the membership with and to discipline the membership with. And so at the same time as it being like just completely checked out, can't be asked, like this is so dead, it's really important. And that is actually such a bad recipe because something so foundational should be really engaging people, should have people feeling excited, should have people feeling like, they've got a stake in the project, and it's having the exact opposite effect.
Yeah, that's really right. And I also think that like if the people who are kind of struggling over making these documents better are able to make some success of it in the founding conference, and it can also be a good basis for increasing confidence amongst people going forward into the new year.
I think, and I think the thing that they suffer from is that in a political party, you will have mechanisms to separate the people who care about stuff such as what happens at conference and what's in the, the documents of the party, and people who are more casual members. Whereas at the moment, because your party's just starting and there's no differentiation between, say, a conference delegate and just someone who wants to turn up and do your party thing, it means you're getting these meetings with people who have all different levels and all different interests, and yeah, it's just not quite working. It's why I'm often drawn back to the Belgian Workers' Party model, where they just have explicitly differentiated layers of leadership and membership, and then amongst those different layers of membership, you have different levels of commitment and responsibility. And you're expected, if you're a militant in the Belgian Workers' Party, to know all the documents and to argue the party line and to give, I think, above like 22,000 euros a year to give the entirety of your salary to the party. And it's just like, and they have these layered memberships, and it's obviously not something your party has at the moment. And I think that is why they're suffering.
Yeah, I guess one thing I'd add to that is that, like, I was speaking to a comrade who was went to the Haringey Regional Assembly, who's part of the Unity Platform and part for Organising for Popular Power, and they kind of spoke about like not really seeing the opportunity to have that kind of fractious confrontational break at the beginning of the event that you said, where like the activists try and make their stake on the event. And they talked about having a bit more of a careful approach in terms of like going to people, talking to people, like thinking about what are the issues that people feel exercised by the most. And that's not at all to kind of denigrate the people who are like really frustrated and want this to work and are clashing with the kind of facilitators at these events. But it is to say that there are like different approaches to take in terms of how you engage people.
And I do think that approach would have been better at the event that I went to.
Yeah.
Because like I do just think, even from my perspective as someone who knew the people that were, doing the intervention, standing up and trying to speak over the speaker and stuff, it just seemed a bit kind of like cantankerous. And it was a bit like, well, there's hundreds of other people here who have come to your party meeting, many of whom it might be the first political meeting ever, and you've got to give them a bit of space to experience what it could be, and give the leadership a chance to do the meeting well.
You're at an event, but this is a process, right? This same person that I mentioned earlier talked about if you were, for example, the person nominated in your group to take notes and read the notes out, like trying to like lift people up with that. And do you know what I mean? And gain some like consensus and get a read of the room. Do you know what I mean? And lift people's spirits up. And I think, it's a not an ideal situation, and that's like a really important approach to carry into these things.
Yeah, and I think there's something to be said around where our leaders are flopping and failing and, flailing around the floor like wet fish. There's the responsibility for activists like ourselves to step into those leadership roles and think through, okay, well, we want to win kind of democratic processes within the party, but we also want to inspire and lead and engage people. And what does that mean for how we show up in these events? It means something quite different to always going for, the cantankerous, the confrontation, and thinking through, okay, well, how are we trying to also win people to a project that we want them to be part of long term?
Okay, cool. So obviously the other big exciting event to happen in the world of left-wing politics alongside the ongoing Your Party assemblies is the election of Zohran Mamdani as mayor of New York City. He's been dominating all of our social media feeds with his happy warrior posture, and yeah, the excitement is palpable. We're going to talk about him for the rest of the podcast, and Shanice has a Zohran-related hot take.
I do. As thrilling and enthralling and exciting as the assemblies have been, I'm very pleased to be moving on to talk about something else. Okay, where should we start? So Zohran Mamdani, member of DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, and the Democratic Party in the US, has won the New York City mayoralty on 50.4% of the vote. Stunning victory. He absolutely trounced Cuomo's filthy coalition that achieved 41.6%. And I call it a filthy coalition because it was a coalition of like the right of the Democratic Party, Republicans who didn't want to see a socialist win in New York City, and then Curtis Sliwa, who won 7.1% of the vote. So it's a huge victory for the left. It's a huge victory for socialists. And I want to argue that identity and identity politics was at the core of that victory. And so where does this argument start? So I think it starts by looking at the base, the electoral base that Zohran Mamdani was trying to build. And in DSA's own words, in Zohran Mamdani's own words, there were three core elements of that base. There were the left and progressives. And that kind of includes, people who have been involved in key social movements in the city. There were South Asians and Muslims who, prior to Zohran Mamdani's campaign, were a really untapped aspect of the electorate. And then there were rent-stabilized tenants. And these three, parts of the electorate, these three groups were considered core to Zohran Mamdani's base. And this then has political implications for kind of what his campaign looked like and how he targeted his campaign. So if we look, for example, at the South Asian and Muslim vote in the election, starting with the primaries, huge turnouts, unseen before. We had Muslims whose voter turnout increased 60% during the primaries. We had neighborhoods that were predominantly South Asian neighborhoods where voter turnout doubled during the primaries. We had, 1 million people voting for Zohran Mamdani in a New York City mayoralty, which was the first time over 1 million people have voted for a mayor since 1969. So we're talking about a huge reorganization of the electoral base in the city. And there was one group in particular that I want to use as an example for why identity was key to his campaign, and it's a group called Drumbeats. So Drumbeats are a South Asian and Indo-Caribbean group in New York City, and they kind of campaign for the interests of South Asian workers and Indo-Caribbean workers. And they were hot. The aunties were hot on Zohran Mamdani's campaign. Like, they were phone banking in like multiple different South Asian languages. They had leaflets, Zohran Mamdani leaflets in South Asian languages. They were out and they were open as kind of proud Muslims, proud South Asians. And I think the context here is really important for New York, right? Like, after 9/11, historically, the South Asian and Muslim communities have been quite hidden. They have historically deliberately done things like cutting their beards, cutting their hair, not wearing hijabs, wearing USA paraphernalia, like, T-shirts with flags on, as a way to avoid, the spiral of hate crimes and Islamophobia and anti-Asian racism. That was a key feature of living in the city as an immigrant post 9/11. And I watched this incredible video about the organizing that happened in the South Asian community. And they were talking about just being proud and open Muslims and Asians in the city again. And this was partly due to Zohran Mamdani kind of openly leading the campaign on the basis of his Muslim identity, reaching out to South Asians really quite openly, talking in his campaign videos about reaching out to, the aunties in the community and stuff like that. But it was crucially because he connected those questions of race and identity and belonging and culture to affordability. And because it's not the case that there's never been South Asian people who have proposed as being candidates before, but they haven't kind of garnered the support of the community in this way, because they haven't been appealing to like the material, I think, interests of the community at that economic and class level as well. But I think the key thing here is that he doesn't do the kind of reductionist thing of either kind of reducing to a liberal identity politics, which is basically, I'm Muslim, you're Muslim, so vote for me. But he also doesn't do that thing of class reductionism, which is that we're not going to talk about race at all, we're just going to talk about economics. He marries the particular experiences to the universal. And there were some really interesting ways that he crafted universal identities. I think the two key ways were, one, through the New Yorker, through this holistic concept of what it means to be a New Yorker, and two, just through a very basic old school concept of being a working person. But he took those kind of two universal identities and kind of entered them through the particular identities, for example, of, as he said in his victory speech, Yemeni taxi drivers, Mexican abuelas, Uzbek nurses, Ethiopian aunties. And he used those kind of particular experiences to connect and to unite and to bring people together on the basis of, more universal identities. And I think the kind of second thing that I would say, as well as him not ignoring identity and race and moving to a class reductionism, he also didn't ignore radical politics that had come out of the social movements. So, for example, I watched Novara Media's coverage of Zohran Mamdani's win, and Michael Walker made, I think, quite an interesting but typical comment that Zohran Mamdani moved away from defunding the police. And for me, this is really just quite a lazy reading of what actually happened during his campaign. Remember what I said? One of the key aspects of his base were the left and progressives that had come out of social movements, particularly BLM and Palestine Solidarity. It would have been a huge mistake for him to kind of break from that base and to deliberately kind of speak in political language and policy speak that kind of broke from that base. And he did equivocate on police and prisons, but actually if you look at the policies that he was proposing in his campaign, I look at those as an abolitionist, and I think actually there's something here to build on. So to give you a few quick examples, it was part of his policy, and in fact he did a video about this, to disband the New York Police Department Strategic Response Group, to completely disband it. Though he doesn't call it defunding, obviously, it was very clear that that's reducing the power of police and the NYPD. Key to his concept of community safety was the Department of Community Safety, which would be a new department that he sets up, that alongside kind of redistributing wealth and thinking through public safety through a public health lens, he would be moving police resources away from things like mental health, homelessness, antisocial behaviour, crimes of survival, gun violence, and moving them to the Department for community safety. So again, he doesn't use the word defund, but he is clearly reducing the power and scope of policing in the city. Another example, he's committed to closing Rikers Island. He's committed to reducing the New York Police Department's overtime budget. Again, not called defund, but reducing the overtime budget means less money to the cops and more money to do other things. So I think I'll wrap up by saying identity, and I think the kind of radical politics of the social movements, such as police critical politics, were absolutely key to him holding this base together. Yes, he did have to equivocate, particularly on policing and Zionism. I say have to, he didn't have to, but he did. And I think particularly in the case of the police, you know, the NYPD crushed Bill de Blasio. They absolutely wiped him out. And so, you know, this is one of the contradictions of a socialist who is taking control of capitalist institutions and leading capitalist institutions. You also have to think through within that contradiction how you hold the various different elements of power under your leadership together. So, you know, while I disagree with it from a political perspective, him saying things like, you know, we need the police, we need to work with the police to keep people safe, and, you know, we need to have a positive relationship with the police, while I disagree with those politically, given the NYPD's history of crushing mayors, I kind of get why he had to do it. But I think we have to, you know, view his campaign way more holistically to, I think, you know, what Michael Walker offered, which was, I think quite a biased interpretation of him moving away from the language of defund, but not really considering the kind of politics of his campaign. And by the way, that debate is still available, Michael Walker, if you want to stop dodging it. But I will.
Come on, Michael.
But I'll stop there. I've got way, way more to say, but I'll hand over to you guys.
Yeah, I mean, fire. You mentioned the kind of totality of Mamdani's campaign, and I think that's really important because I said on a previous episode that I think one of the most important things about Mamdani's campaign is that it's like a kind of claim over the right to the city. You know, there, for example, taxi drivers who were committing suicide because of the extortionate price of a medallion, who Zohran went on hunger strike with, like the unaffordable groceries priced out by rents, eye water and childcare bills, the state harassment of the racialized homeless and poor. This was a campaign about making the city a place where those who make it tick can actually afford to live a life. And contrary to a kind of argument that's going around on the left where the claim is made that Zohran's campaign eschews identity for class politics, I just don't think you can understand Zohran's campaign unless you understand how class manifests itself, precisely as Shanice was saying, through questions like race and gender, but also how it's central to the identity of a particular image of New York, which was baked into the campaign from like day dot. And I think this is like really important because look, there's no substitute for a good ground game. There's no substitute for organization, experience, for politics. But I do think one of the things that the left should absolutely learn from Mamdani's campaign is that is understanding how culture can do heavy lifting in politics. His campaign worked in no small part because it re-articulated existing subjectivities around New York for New Yorkers. So there's this great quote from Waleed Shahid on his Substack, and he's a kind of political strategist, about how the campaign promoted an idea of belonging. So before corruption and costs, there's a prior question. Are you inside the we? Mamdani makes that explicit. Immigrants aren't a problem to manage. They are the story, the labor, language, and live reality that make New York work. I think that's really important. I think there's another element there, and this might sound a bit ridiculous, but I do also think the fact that Zohran was a rapper is a bit underplayed here too, especially because the whole campaign in a city that birthed hip-hop has operated upon the kind of grammar of the MC. You know, the constant jabs back at Cuomo in the debates, you know, keep your name out of my mouth. Constant references to hip-hop classics, playing Jadakiss and Ja Rule as he leaves stage after he's had this back and forth with 50 Cent, who used to have beef with Ja Rule, using Mario Cuomo quotes to ridicule his son, Andrew. The kind of sense of the campaign's kind of charming street-side tempo, but also its ability to wield disses when necessary. I think this is why the point about identity is really important. Because he's articulating the identity of New Yorkers and the kind of rhythm of the everyday multiculture into a kind of class story of affordability, only possible if you recognize in this history and present, not a class politics that reduces everything to the economy, and not a communitarian politics, as Shanice said, which brokers different community leaderships into a kind of awkward coalition, but a kind of coalitional mosaic a kind of immigrant sewer socialism with such a deep and long history in New York's politics, let alone the politics of other cities across the US. And all of this is before you get to the actual visual design of the campaign, which riffs of a specifically New York aesthetic, drawing influence from bodega signage, the Metro card, the lottery ticket, Bollywood movie posters as well. Anish Bapathi, the lead designer for the campaign, was interviewed. I think this is really good. I'm really happy I found this. Was interviewed by the Hollywood Reporter and was asked, what's the term for the overall visual look of his campaign? And he answered, I guess they call it branding. I feel that's a little corporate, and I prefer to call it identity work. I think that's really important. So for me, there's this big question of how we build organizations that are rooted and understand the places that they live in and the people they share the world with. Because it seems to me that this question of identity formation, a question which the left is just like, I think, confuses with liberal identity politics a lot, and taking meaningfully the problems people face and how they track through race and gender is central to the birthing of a new class politics in our moment.
I think that's completely true. And I do think that Zohran Mamdani's campaign has shown the kind of the emptiness and the poverty and the thinness of a very kind of straight down the line economic reductionist take, which is like, you run on class and economic issues, and as long as you do that, you will win. No, if you don't create this sense of belonging, if you don't leverage like a certain authenticity about yourself, where you max up the traits that are gonna play well and build a big we to 11, and then go forth on those traits, which is completely what Mamdani does. You know what I mean? Like, it's clear that Mamdani is genuinely a kind, loving, intelligent, likes to be around people person who just fucking loves being in New York and being a New Yorker, and that's who he is. Like that, all of that's genuine. Like, we know that's genuine. It's not just because he's got good social media, it's because you couldn't do the videos that he does and you couldn't do all the different interactions that he does if that wasn't actually him. I think that all of that is completely true. I just think that it's really important for us, and we are doing it in this conversation, and I just feel like anyone listening, I just really would want them to take this away, this very precise distinction between identity and identity forming and forming the sense of belonging, and then maybe quite specifically liberal identity politics.
Absolutely.
So a certain politics which uses identity to divide people from each other, to build walls and to basically say, well, if you have that identity trait and I have this one, we can't possibly have anything in common. We can't build solidarity between us. We couldn't engage in shared struggle. Like, that is not what Zohran Mamdani has just done at all. And his whole thing was, as you say, Shanice, to name the Yemeni taxi drivers, the Mexican abuelas, the Uzbek nurses. It was to name all of these different identities and bring them together in this coherent whole and this shared whole that is, a New Yorker. And I think this sense of place that is core to the sense of identity. I don't think the identity works without place, actually. It's reflected in some other really good campaigns you're seeing in the US too at the moment. There's this guy called Graham Plattner, although in the main accent that he has, it's like Graham Plattner. Graham Plattner. And Graham Plattner is just...
Did we allow accents on the show?
Yeah, mate, I'm doing it. It's a North American accent, it's fine. And he is just unlike anybody you've ever seen on the left, or at least on the left in the past 20 or 30 years, because he's a veteran oyster farmer from Maine who, in his launch campaign video, is doing push-ups or whatever, and he's just stacked, and you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And he has gone through some controversies recently because it turned out that he had a massive Nazi tattoo on his chest. And that's been a whole thing. And there's been this really interesting distinction between the people in Maine who seem to still want to vote for him and people still turn up to his rallies, and then the online left who are understandably asking questions because he's got a massive Nazi tattoo on his chest. But he's another example of someone who has this authentic identity that works in the place where he's running, and his identity connects to the place that he is running in. Like, his identity is someone from Maine in the way that Zohran's identity is someone from New York. And I think it's really, really important, that link between place and identity.
Yeah, I think this also raises the question of, how much is this replicable? That's a hard word,
Replicable.
Replicable. There we go. How much can you replicate this? elsewhere, right? And I've seen debates taking place online saying, oh, look, he's done this in New York. How are you going to do this in, the Yorkshire heartlands where people moved away from left-wing politics, the Labour Party, and have moved towards reform? And I think that's the wrong way to look at it. What Zohran Mamdani did in New York can't be replicated in LA or New Orleans or Chicago or Atlanta or London, because we're talking about different places with different markers of identity, with different stories to tell, with different types of people, with different literal physical structures and connections to place and space and history. But what we can learn from it, and the lesson we can take, is actually that we need to be telling these stories about place. The US doesn't have these weird debates that we have in the UK around identity politics. Actually, they don't have the debate in the same way, because the right understands that identity and culture is absolutely key to politics, and they have penetrated every aspect of people's culture and social and leisure lives and created new conservative right-wing identities off the back of that. And clearly Zohran Mamdani and the radical left in the US get that. And actually that's what we need to be taking outside of London, in the Midlands, in the North. We need to be connecting to what are the local histories, what are the local ways that people understand their sense of self and purpose and identity, and how can we take those local stories and connect them to a broader vision of, well, what the wider working class looks like in the UK, what immigrants have contributed to this country, what we have built collectively together as working class people of different races and of different backgrounds. How can we take those local stories and connect them to these bigger universal questions? And I think that is how you do the two things that are often pitched as being opposed to each other, which don't have to be. And I think New York teaches us that, which is, do we want to shift politics, and do we want to shift where people are at, or do we want to just appeal to them? And actually there are ways to appeal to how people see the world and also take them on a journey. And I think that's one of the key things that we've learned from Zohran Mamdani's campaign. The final thing I'll just say, and I will bait you out, Jonas, but Jonas said something to me privately that I'm now going to make public.
Oh, Lord.
Which is that oftentimes people who argue against all forms of identity politics and all mentions of race and anti-racism and gender and queer sexuality and trans identity, these people are often just really sourceless and actually just don't understand why people like grip onto culture and identity, because they're kind of sourceless and vibesless and don't have those cultural connections themselves. And I will just say, to be a bit ID poll, it isn't a surprise to me that the majority of people making these arguments, really passionately online, are middle-class white men who do have a bit of a stale culture. I'm sorry. Like, it is just kind of true. And I will look forward to being cussed out about that. But, there is something about being working class, and there's something about being black or an ethnic minority in a country that despises you, that creates resistance, cultural resistance. Your whole being is wrapped up in struggling for your place in the world. And unless you go through that, you don't understand why it shapes how you look at everything.
Mm.
But I just start with but to take the piss. No, I agree with all of that, but we also can't lose sight of the fact that he did also run on a very economic message that was like incredibly disciplined. You know what I mean? Like, and it's these two things, right? You build this broader culture, this sense of identity, this sense of belonging, which is just incredibly particular and multifaceted and gets swept up into this big we. And then you have an incredibly disciplined focus on, it doesn't always have to be economic stuff.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't necessarily have to be economic stuff at all. It happened to be, you can characterize rent busters, childcare and affordability as economic, but like, we can't really just reduce our kids to economics, right? Like, it's not like childcare. Yeah, but I'll get onto policing though, because policing is an interesting one in the sense that he had policies on it, but he didn't make it core to his campaign. And there are signs that if he's not going to deliver on something, it may well be his policing agenda, for various reasons. But we should just we should just also not lose sight of like this incredibly disciplined and resilient focus on fast and free buses, freezing the rent, and free childcare. And that was, you know what I mean, that was the stuff that he kept talking about because everybody cared about it, you know, and it was a universal concern for the coalition of New Yorkers that he was trying to build. I just want to share a quote that I found, and I'm now going to paraphrase because I can't actually see the quote in front of me, which speaks to something that Shanice was talking about, which is that Mamdani at the start of his campaign sat down with one of his advisors, I think it was Maurice Katz, and, you know, Katz was like, well, public safety is a massive concern for people at the polls. You know, it's the thing that people care about. It's crime. Like, are we going to run on it? What are we going to do about it? And he was just like, no, we're going to do affordability. Like, we're going to do affordability. And that was him saying, I'm not going to run on the thing that is currently most important to people. I'm going to find an issue that is important to people, but is also a thing that I can very directly answer with my politics as a socialist, and I'm going to run on that because I know people care about it, but also through running it, I'm going to push it up the agenda so it then becomes top. And that's that nice little interplay that you were talking about, Shanice, between both running on popular issues, but at the same time taking people on a journey. Because there's no point if we just become arch triangulators like centrists, where we just look at polls and then pick the top issue and then say things about that. That's not a socialist political strategy at all. It's just not.
Yeah, and just to quickly add something on to the picture that I've been painted. Obviously, you know, I'm a Marxist, and so
Are you?
Oi, Goldilocks, don't try it. Got balls politics over here with Jonas, Marvin. But yeah, no, as a Marxist, obviously class is central, right? And class is it's the ultimate unifier. But that's always that question of how do you get people to come together, and how you get them to come together is not by ignoring where they're at, but by finding that kind of that glue that allows people to embrace who they are as they are, but as a collective. I think there are four ways of understanding identity politics. There's neoliberal liberal identity politics, which is I'm different to you, the differences are irreconcilable, we just need to look after our own interests. Sod that, ditch it, put it in the bin, get rid. Then there's this like status quo identity politics, which pitches itself as like being anti-woke. And it's like, yeah, identity politics is bad. But actually, I do agree with identity politics when it's like working class white men. Then it's fine. Then it's fine. But otherwise, no. And again, reactionary, ditch it, bad. Then there's right-wing identity politics, which is we're going to completely redefine British and ethnic identity. This country's for our people. Get rid of the immigrants. White people are great. Black people are bad. And then there's what I think Zohran Mamdani and real socialism really argues for, which is, I think, a Marxist identity politics, which is understanding the ways in which gender, sexuality, race, migration status are mediate class and are mediated through class, and how we can then use those as powerful tools to bring people together as a class. And that's the key. I'll hand over to you, Goldilocks.
Cheers, sis. It's true, I am bold. Thank you. But look, just to Joe, like, I think it's important what economics you do and why that matters, right? Like for example, he's not talking about wages so much. He's not talking about, he's talking about municipal groceries, but he's not talking about taking over anything for municipal ownership, for example. He is talking about particular economic questions that are both high salience, but also relate to particular sections of like New York's proletariat and working class, right? And I think that's really important, the question of what economics you do and how that relates to the question of culture and politics and assembling a coalition. But I think something that we've kind of alluded to but haven't really talked about a bit, which I kind of want to bring up, is this question of power. Because there is an analog to Zohran in the US right now already. In Chicago, you have a left-wing mayor, Brandon Johnson, with big support from the kind of radical Chicago Teachers Union, who has been in the mayoralty for a bit of time now and has faced crisis, sabotage, and wave after wave of particularly ICE violence, immigration and customs enforcement violence. A friend I was chatting to who lives in Chicago was just telling me about it, and it sounds insane. The Mamdani campaign in New York, a place of much more global and national significance than Chicago will face an almighty assault that will make that look like a walk in the park. So there are big questions that are posed by like someone like Zohran Mamdani with his historical politics, who he is, his faith, what he represents, being in that mayoralty. And I think maybe this is where I slightly disagree with both of you, which is I think Nikhil Pal Singh in an article in Dissent magazine kind of talked about how Mamdani has kind of compromised already in agreeing to retain Jessica Tisch as police commissioner. Tisch is on record opposing reforms such as raising the age of criminal responsibility and dissolving the gang database. Now, so they agree on matters of like police corruption, for example, but the outcome of potential conflicts between them, for example, over the strategic response group, over establishing the Department for Community Safety, will be big tests of Mamdani's mayoralty, basically. And so there's one kind of, I thought, fascinating potential way in which this, in which the left is able to exercise some agency into this situation that has kind of been launched. And I don't know if you guys have seen it, but the Our Time campaign has come out. And so this is a kind of continuation of the campaign's field operation, but specifically designed to mobilize voters to push for the policy agenda that Mamdani ran on. Now, there's a question about which parts of the policy agenda are like seen as priorities to fight over, but this strikes me as quite interesting, right? Like, because on the one hand, you have these tensions with the police department, but on the other hand, next year, Kathy Hochul, who's the New York State governor, will be up for re-election. And so will a campaign like this, which extends the field operation of Mamdani's campaign with the DSA, New York City DSA behind it, be able to squeeze Hochul and put pressure on Hochul, or even set up a different candidate? I don't know. I'm not that au fait about the situation, to ensure their bargaining position against the New York State governor, who is not that interested in raising taxes, the kind of taxes which Mamdani needs to push through large parts of his committed agenda. I think these are some of the questions that we have to think about a little bit too, because there's a kind of old American Marxist nostrum, which is that the Democratic Party is the graveyard of social movements. I think this is a moment where that's going to be tested. And I find it at least a source of encouragement that, like, from the left in New York, there are these vehicles that are emerging who are prepared and preparing for the task of how you confront power with power in a way that I just don't think large parts of the left across the continent and in the global north, at least, have taken remotely seriously in their times in institutional power. And that, I think, goes from Syriza to Podemos to Corbynism.
Yeah, one thing that was really encouraging about the group Drumbeats, the South Asian and Indo-Caribbean group that I mentioned earlier, is they have a really lucid sense of, we got Mamdani in, or actually the video I watched was, we're going to get Mamdani in. And then we're going to hold his feet to the fire.
Yeah.
And we're going to make sure that he delivers on what we have campaigned for. And I think that is really key. And I think for me, one of the big lessons about the political context in the UK, which is that at the moment, I think there is this enrapture with the electoral. You know, the polls, people are just got their eyes glued to the polls and how many points the Greens are surging above the Labour Party, which is fun. And, you know, I like to see it. And I like a viral tweet that, you know, makes fun of the Labour Party tanking in the polls. Love it. Fine with it. And then, you know, people are asking a question of where your party will sit once it officially launches and, you know, where it will sit in the polls and what aspects of the electorate it will be able to capture versus the Greens. And we're having all these kind of conversations about elections and polls, very little conversation about the kind of movement that we need to build and create and sustain in order to make any kind of electoral victory at a very local level in councils, at a more governmental level, something that is actually useful for the left and for our people. And it's great to hear Our Time has been launched because, you know, you talked about kind of the balances of power and, you know, running for governor. And one of the key balances of power is going to be the street movement and the extent to which it is big and large enough to not only be able to hold Zohran Mamdani to account and create some sense of like accountability, but also to signal to the establishment that we're fucking serious. Yeah, I think that is something that we are really missing on the left at the moment. Me and my partner talk about this often, about this idea of comms brain and how just like everyone focuses on messaging and media performance and comms. And in the case of Zohran Mamdani, what you lose, the fact that he's had a ground and field campaign of over 100,000 volunteers. And it's been those boots on the ground that have knocked on 3 million doors and won this. And there's a similar thing I think that we need to recognise in the UK, that Zach Polansky and any kind of new leader that we get in your party performing really well in the polls or performing really well on Newsnight or BBC Question Time is great, and we need that, but is going to be nowhere near enough to achieve the kind of systemic change that we need to actually make people's lives better.
The only thing I'll say is that these organizations that are set up by candidates who have been successful in the US to supposedly, like campaign for their agenda and mobilize or organize all the volunteers that came through their campaign have just like a really like bad record. You've got Sanders' Our Revolution, which just like didn't go anywhere basically, and was kind of like strangled by bureaucrats and people around Sanders. You had Obama's Organizing for America, which just had like a similar thing. Got the recent Against the Oligarchs tour that Sanders and AOC did around the US, where they were having these massive rallies, getting loads of people in one place. And part of the point of it was meant to be to organize these people afterwards into local groups or whatever. And also a lot of the money that they raised from those rallies was meant to go into hiring organizers. But as far as I can tell, they've hired a handful of organizers across the country after that. The difference this time is that Zohran is really the first proper DSA candidate to achieve high office. And what I mean by that is, AOC was found by an organization called Justice Democrats that went and found people who were just like out in society to run, and then subsequently endorsed by the DSA. Sanders had been knocking around as an independent senator for decades before, he ran for presidency, and then he was endorsed by the DSA. So this is like the first proper kind of like DSA cadre. Zohran really came from New York DSA. He knows all of those people. His inner circle are New York DSA people, right? So this is like their first proper candidate. And it's going to be really interesting to see whether he sticks to his, kind of like socialist training and orientation. And I think we're going to have to really try and separate Zohran keeping true to his socialist orientation and I would say the inevitable maneuvers and compromises that he's going to have to make on certain principles in office. And I just, this goes to your point earlier, Shanice, like, I think the reality of taking the mayoralty as a BDS supporting democratic socialist in New York, like, the heart of global capitalism really, is that you're going to have this whole massive array of forces lined up against you, and you're going to have to maneuver, and you're going to have to pick your battles, and you're going to have to try and separate off different sections of capital and ameliorate some and have meetings with some, as he's been doing. He's had this like offensive of meetings with all of these different business interests across the city to basically say to them like, look, like, chill out. It's not going to be revolution in New York from day one. We're going to do this, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. He's also, as part of his transition team, selected a bunch of people that have quite deep experience of governance or running big organizations. They're not just all DSA people. And this is in part him recognizing that this is a left liberal coalition that he's leading. It was most clearly expressed by the Brad Lander endorsement during the race. Brad Lander is the city comptroller. He was one of the other candidates for mayor. He dropped out and endorsed Mamdani. Brad Lander's a left liberal. But this is Zohran recognizing that, this is the left leading a left liberal coalition in the way that when Biden got in, Biden was a liberal leading a liberal left coalition. And we shouldn't forget that, the transition team for Biden had lots of Sanders people on that. And I think that Zohran is looking at this and he's not actually taking a class war position. He's not taking the position that some people would if they managed to get the mayoralty of a big city, which is we can use this as a stage to like show the contradictions of capitalism and have these big battles with capital and do this like big spectacular thing. That some battles will inevitably happen, but he's following a far more what they call in the US sewer socialist approach, which is in this history of socialist mayors in the US staking their reputation on delivery. And I think this is why he ran on a very, very clear platform of freezing the rent and fast and free buses and free childcare, is that because those three things stretch the limits of what the mayoralty can do, but they're just about possible. Like he chose stuff that is just about possible within stretching the limits of mayoralty. And this brings us on to the NYPD, right? Like, them keeping Tish was a big deal. This person would have been like at the bottom of the list of the people the DSA would have wanted to run the NYPD. He explicitly apologized for saying he'd defund the NYPD. And from my understanding, this is part of a strategy where he understands that if Trump sends the troops into New York and he doesn't have the NYPD on side, or at least he doesn't have the NYPD not being antagonistic towards him, he's in an incredibly difficult position. Like what can he do about that? Even if Trump doesn't send the troops in, he's a civilian mayor. The NYPD are a notoriously militarized police force. Like you simply don't have enough power as a new mayor to make enemies of all of these people right away. And I think it will demand a lot of maturity from the US left and a lot of deft to navigate this and to understand when Zohran is stepping back from things that he shouldn't step back from and compromising his principles, as it were, and when he's doing essentially strategic maneuvers that power demands of you.
I think particularly on that question of policing, I mean, we should ask ourselves the question of whether the police are a reliable actor to defend communities against ICE. I mean, the experience in Chicago is obviously not the case that has borne out. And I think there's a kind of a broader point here, which we haven't really experienced in Britain. We talked about last week about like how we kind of flip-flop between the movements and then the electoral arena. What happens when you do get both? Because you can't, and in the situation of like a heavily migrant working class city, that's a real prospect if you have ICE coming in trying to run rampage, and you just can't always turn the tap on and off on social movements. Sometimes you can, there's a great history of social democratic parties doing precisely that, but sometimes you can't. And what do you do politically? I mean, I think it's a good thing that you can't personally, but what do you do politically when that is the case? I think it's worth saying that like our time is deeply related to the DSA, but it's not strictly a DSA thing. Do you know what I mean? Like that's important because I do think like in this moment, in this particular scenario where the left has hegemony over the liberals, trying to forge a kind of united front coalition that involves people to your right and liberals in defense of Mamdani's agenda can be a deeply radicalizing phenomenon. And I think that's really important. But I guess I wanted to say two final things, which is on the one hand, when we talked about the issues that you do pick and fight in terms of your campaign agenda and your policies and stuff, I think that's a really important thing to think about in the context where if the Greens or your party decides to run loads of mayoral campaigns and loads of municipal campaigns across this country where the scope for power in incredibly centralized, incredibly disempowered local government, we do have to think about those questions. Like where are the examples where we can actually wield power and get stuff through without being a complete disaster and a complete failure? And then there's another question, which I think is the basic context to all of this, which is that like Corbynism, there's a big thing here. And, NYC DSA is like one of the most developed political organizations in like the cross-Atlantic left, right? For all intents and purposes. But like at the same time, there's this thing of like running ahead on the institutional front, which I'm not saying is a bad move. I think it was absolutely the right decision, but doing that way before the social movement has necessarily learned to walk. And that's a kind of constant tension that we confront when we live in set of circumstances where we're kind of living with the defeats of the labor movements and the left over the last 40 years that we kind of have to reckon with and deal with, but not in a way that says don't go for that opportunity there. Because I think that's really important that we do go for those opportunities.
I think, and this point might be a little bit scattered because I'm just trying to formulate it in my head, but the right are really good at seizing opportunities and building their position and their balance of power over time. So I think of the career of someone like Nigel Farage, for example, who's been at this gambit of eventually being the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom for nearly over 3 decades now. And he's kind of been slowly building over time, being a member of the European Parliament, being a central figure of the referendum vote, being a kind of voice in the UKIP party. Before that, the Conservative Party, pushing at the boundaries of what's politically acceptable and possible to say. And he's been pushing and pushing and pushing, not on his own. He's not this individual figure, but he's been pushing for years and years and years to the point where the man is possibly about to be, Prime Minister. I was about to say president. He's clearly nearly about to be Prime Minister of the UK. And I think For us as socialists, as Marxists, as abolitionists, we need to be much better at seeing opportunities to build as opposed to just seeing, contradictions of principle. And so I think I disagree with you on the policing thing from the perspective of it's about power. So, negotiations are never neutral. He's not just going to be mayor and he's, leading the NYPD, and therefore that means if he wants to push things through, he's got to be nice to the NYPD. It's a question of power. It's a question of where power sits. I think of, for example, at the tail end of the BLM movement and the Kill the Bill movement in the UK. And that year, 2022, I think it was, where the movement was so strong, it ended up being that Sadiq Khan had to sack Cressida Dick. These things don't happen by accident. They happen as a result of the balance of power.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that is the key question. I look at, as an abolitionist, as a revolutionary, as a Marxist, I look at Zohran Mamdani's policies on police, and I think this is a serious place for us to build on, like a department for community safety that doesn't involve police and moves resources away from the police into caring institutions. Boom, let's go. This is what we want. Him not using the word defund, I kind of don't care about that. We have debates amongst abolitionists on what language is best to, raise the profile of our ideas. I do think we get into dangerous territory when we're we need to, as a point of strategy, capitulate on principle in order to make our policies more possible. Actually, I think the question that we need to be asking is, how do we build the power to make those strategic maneuvers unnecessary? Because those sorts of strategic maneuvers where you're capitulating on principle come from a position of weakness. And the question is, how do we build the power to not have to do that? I think that's a key lesson for us in the UK. We're at such a point of weakness that the debate that we often have is, well, what of our radical left ideas do we need to abandon in order to appeal to these right-wing or racist or, conservative reform voters? Take whichever of those are applicable to whichever individual. Not calling all reform voters racist, but a lot of them are. And this is just completely the wrong question. The question is, well, how do we build power in order to shift the entire landscape?
Yeah, look, I do completely agree with that, and I'm not just saying that because it's easier to say that you completely agree with your podcast co-host. But I really do, in the sense that it's not that we should chastise ourselves and whip ourselves for being too pure, and it's there's this ugly racist electorate out there that we need to triangulate around because they couldn't possibly be like us. I don't think we should think in that way, but it just is the case that once you're the mayor of New York, the NYPD is just this incredibly powerful force that could be the difference between destroying a mayoralty or not. And they're a very real block within the city that you have to take into account. And especially with the history of them destroying de Blasio, you know what I mean? But I think your orientation around seeing these things as a serious place to build from, and always looking in terms of what's the kind of future trajectory of this, and have we made ground or have we lost ground? Thinking in those terms, I think is precisely correct.
Yeah, and I think we have this really, helpful concept in the abolitionist movement of non-reformist reforms. Are the reforms that we're bringing in taking us closer to the place that we want to get to, or are they taking us further away? And I think that's the question we always need to ask.
All right, so this week's reading, this is the bit where we recommend you a little bit of reading that we've been enjoying over the past week. Jonas, what have you got for us?
Well, last week we talked about Palestine solidarity work, and I alluded to a bit of a tension within the movement between mobilizing on the one hand and organizing on the other. But what I didn't mention is that there is a great example transcending this tension, and that is the Bristol Apartheid Free Zone, which tries to make BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions, a tangible reality by combining local boycotts with systemic wider boycotts and door-knocking exercises, talking to people about Palestine and BDS. It's a model that's spreading across the country, and it seems to me at least to do a fantastic job of combining organizing, counterculture and tactical mobilizations. And you can get a good insight on all this by listening to some of the organizers behind it discuss it at the Bristol Cable.
Nice. Shanice, what you got?
So I just want to apologize in advance if I butcher this guy's name. But there's this new book called We Were There, How Black Culture, Resistance and Community Shaped Modern Britain by Lonre Bakari. It's just out in hardback at the moment. But I'm doing research for projects that might become public knowledge at some point in the future on the history of Black people in Britain. And
Wow.
I haven't finished the book, but so far, fantastic. And yeah, really would recommend giving it a read.
Cool. And I got a nerdy one for everyone this week. It is Michael Lange's Substack, which is at michaellange.nyc. It's called Narrative Wars. And he's just basically this New York lefty DSA nerd who has been around for about a decade or more and is, I think over the last couple of years, just decided that he is going to become the kind of left electoral, I'm going to predict every election kind of like ward by ward dude in New York. And he puts so much effort into his kind of like various incredibly intricate and well-researched blog posts. And there's some wonderful videos of him kind of like walking around the Zohran victory party with the laptop taped to his chest. Like, it's like taped to his chest, and then you got fucking Hassan Piker like drifting around behind him, just dissing all of the like right-wing journalists. He's got his laptop just like here. It's like, oh my god, another 200,000 votes to drop. But I love these people, and I especially love these people if they're left-wing. And this he's our guy, and his Substack's just really good. So we'll link it. We'll link it in the show notes. Thanks so much, guys. It was wonderful to talk about Zohran. We'll be back in 2 weeks. As always, if you can like and share and subscribe and follow and send us abuse on social media or maybe nice things over email too, we would love that. We will see you again in 2 weeks. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Just a proscript for any white middle class men who may be offended by my comments earlier. Look, I got loads of white middle class male friends, you know.
Not
just to say. So look, it's not even deep like that. It's not personal or anything. It's just, yeah. Look, I'm just gonna stop talking.
It's love.
It's love.